A revolutionary president walks into a hostile TV studio. What happens next shocks the entire world. During a heated live talk show, Burkina Faso's leader Ibrahim Traoré faces unexpected disrespect from a smug, confrontational host. But with sharp words and commanding presence, Traoré turns the tables live on air, leaving the host stunned and the audience roaring in disbelief. This moment went instantly viral, showing the world his strength, class, and unshakable resolve. Here's how one man's dignity changed everything, and why millions are still talking about it today. Monday evening, 6:45 p.m., inside Studio 5 of the national TV station Leo Direct in Paris. Cameras were rolling, the crowd was buzzing. Tonight's episode of Favor had been teased for weeks. The guest, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, revolutionary leader and acting president of Burkina Faso. It was meant to be a respectful interview, but behind the scenes, something else was brewing. The host, Marc Delarme, was known for his sharp tongue, smug smirks, and veiled insults, especially toward African leaders. And tonight he came ready for war. Traoré walked into the studio calmly, wearing a modest suit with no flashy pins or decorations, just his usual focused eyes and unshakable posture. He greeted the crew warmly, extending his hand to everyone he met. But Marc didn't even stand to shake his hand. The red light blinked on, cameras rolled, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. Marc leaned forward with a cold smile that could freeze hell itself. President Traoré, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. Should I call you that, or rebel commander? The audience gasped softly, sensing the immediate disrespect. Ibrahim's face remained perfectly still, showing a restraint that would make Gandhi proud. But Marc wasn't done twisting the knife. Tell me, he continued, his smirk growing wider. Do you really believe you have the experience to sit with real-world leaders? The room held its breath. Marc chuckled smugly, as if he had just delivered the killing blow. He looked directly into the camera, expecting applause, expecting validation. But none came. The silence was deafening. The audience could feel something was terribly wrong. This wasn't journalism. This was an ambush. And Ibrahim Traoré was about to show the world exactly how a real leader responds to disrespect. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back gently, his eyes showing not anger, but something far more powerful: disappointment. He turned slowly and looked toward the studio audience, his gaze lingering on a young black girl seated in the front row, her eyes wide with hope and expectation. Then he finally spoke, and his words would echo around the world. In my country, Ibrahim began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of mountains. We don't measure a man's worth by how much he wears on his chest, but by how many children sleep safely at night because of him. The room held its breath like the world had stopped spinning. Marc shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smugness beginning to crack. Well, you've been accused of... Marc tried to interrupt, but Ibrahim raised his hand politely, not aggressively, and said with quiet authority, "Let me finish." The audience leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something historic. People like you, Ibrahim said slowly, each word deliberate as a surgeon's cut, think power is wearing a tie in Paris, but real power is standing in front of your people when bullets fly and refusing to run. Gasps echoed through the studio. Marc's lips twitched, his confidence evaporating like morning mist. Ibrahim leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now but somehow more commanding. You ask if I belong with world leaders. I ask you, do they belong with their people? In the control room backstage, producers were frozen. One whispered. He flipped it. The director stared at the screen, shaking his head in amazement. No, he corrected. He owned it. But Ibrahim wasn't done. What came next would leave the host speechless and break the internet by morning. Marc tried desperately to recover, his voice shaking slightly. That's very poetic, President. But poetry doesn't stop terrorists. For the first time, Ibrahim's jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed, showing the incredible self-control of a man who had seen real war. You're right, he said gently, nodding with respect. But dignity does. Hope does. A leader without hope is more dangerous than any gunman. The words hung in the air like thunder. Mark was scrambling now, shuffling his notes, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Then Ibrahim did something no one expected, something that would change everything. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn from being carried close to his heart. "This," he said, his voice beginning to crack not from weakness but from pure, unfiltered truth, "is a letter from a 9-year-old girl in Kaya. Her village was attacked by terrorists. She lost her father in the violence. But she still wrote to thank me for protecting her school." The entire studio went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from fear, but the profound quiet that comes when people realize they're witnessing something sacred. Mark stared at the paper in Ibrahim's hands, completely lost. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a reckoning, and it was far from over. Ibrahim began to read the letter out loud, and as he did, something magical happened. The little girl's words, written in broken French but overflowing with gratitude, filled every corner of that studio. "Dear President Traoré, they took Papa but you saved our school. Teacher says we can still learn. I want to be like you when I grow up. Thank you for not leaving us." By the time he finished reading, even the cameraman's hands were shaking. Tears were flowing freely throughout the audience. Mark sat there, his mouth slightly open, staring at his notes that suddenly seemed meaningless. This wasn't the show he had planned. This wasn't the narrative he wanted to control. But sometimes, truth has a way of breaking through even the most carefully constructed walls. Then something happened that no one could have scripted. A woman in the audience, dark-skinned and softly dressed, slowly stood up. Tears were already streaming down her face as she found her voice. "I know you," she whispered, her words carrying across the deadly quiet studio. "My father used to tell me about leaders like you. Men who fight for their people, not for money." Mark tried to cut her off, his voice cracking. "Ma'am, this is not." But she wasn't finished. Her voice grew stronger, trembling with decades of suppressed pain and sudden hope. That word, hope. The studio held its breath as she continued, her words becoming a battle cry that would soon echo across continents. "You sit there mocking him," she said, pointing at Mark with righteous fury. "But you don't know what courage looks like. You've never had to protect a village, hold a dying child, or stand alone against the world." The whole room was frozen in time. Ibrahim didn't move a muscle. His eyes locked with hers in a moment of perfect understanding. Then she turned to face him directly, and what she said next would be replayed millions of times across the globe. "You're not just a guest," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You're hope. Hope." That single word would become a rallying cry. Mark looked completely lost, fidgeting with his pen like a schoolboy caught cheating. For the first time in his career, he saw that this wasn't just politics or entertainment. This was about pain, about history, about pride. And someone had just awakened a sleeping lion. By dawn, the internet had erupted like a volcano. TikTok loops, YouTube shorts, Facebook reposts spreading like wildfire. The woman's cry, "You're not just a guest, you're hope," was now everywhere, translated into 100 languages, shared 1,000 times per minute. And right beside her words in that same clip, Ibrahim Traoré's silent, steady face, showing no anger, no need for a comeback, just pure dignity in human form. But the story was just beginning, and what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. In Ouagadougou, students marched peacefully through the streets, holding up handmade cardboard signs that read, "Hope wears a uniform," and "Our voice is no longer silent." At a small cafe in Paris, a little boy of African descent watched the clip on his mother's tablet. He turned to her with wonder in his eyes and asked, "Mama, is he a king?" She smiled through her tears and replied, "No, my son, something better. He's a servant of his people." Meanwhile, Mark's bosses weren't smiling. They called an emergency meeting as sponsors threatened to walk away and comment sections turned brutal. The internet had spoken, and it wasn't kind to those who mock dignity. But Ibrahim Traoré? He said nothing. He didn't post on social media, didn't tweet, didn't boast about his viral moment. Because as they say in Africa, when a lion walks, he doesn't need to roar. The studio executives, panicking about their reputation, called Ibrahim's team. Please, they begged. We need him back. This time we'll give him a full hour, no interruptions, complete control. But the president didn't answer right away. Instead, he spent that evening walking the quiet streets of Lyon, visiting a refugee shelter. No cameras, no press, just his presence among people who needed hope. A little girl there hugged his leg and whispered, "They said you're like magic." Ibrahim knelt down to her level and said softly, "No, little one, I'm just a man." But magic happens when people believe in each other. Back at his hotel, his assistant handed him the official invitation for the second TV appearance. Ibrahim read it slowly, then looked up with a slight smile. "Tell them I accept," he said quietly. Then, after a pause that seemed to last forever, he added, "But this time, I'll bring my brothers with me." "Which brothers, sir?" his assistant asked, confused. Traoré's smile widened just a fraction. "The ones whose voices were never invited." The second appearance wasn't just a return. It was a reckoning. This time, Ibrahim didn't walk into the studio alone. Behind him came a silent procession of guests, men and women from across Africa and the diaspora. A nurse from Bamako, a war orphan from Sudan, a professor from Dar es Salaam. Each carried their story. Each had been unheard for too long. Mark tried to smile as they entered, but his face twitched nervously. Even the audience noticed his discomfort. Ibrahim shook his hand warmly and said with genuine kindness, "Thank you for inviting us. We've brought some truths with us." There was no anger in his tone, but the air felt heavy with expectation. As they all took their seats and the cameras began to roll, everyone in that studio knew they were about to witness history being rewritten. The nurse spoke first, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She held up a photograph of a burned hospital in Burkina Faso, the destruction clear and heartbreaking. "Terrorists destroyed this place," she said simply. "President Traoré sent medical supplies within 48 hours. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't make speeches. He just acted." Mark blinked, unsure of what to say. Then the professor stepped forward, adjusting his glasses as he spoke. "My university was losing funding. We were about to close our doors to hundreds of students. This man," he pointed to Ibrahim, "redirected his own presidential salary for an entire semester to keep us running. No fanfare, no publicity. We only found out months later. One by one, the stories poured in. No screaming, no drama, just proof. Living, breathing evidence of leadership in action." The audience sat stunned, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Mark's face had gone pale. This wasn't the show he had planned, and it was far from over. Then the youngest guest stood up. A boy, maybe 12 years old, nervous and small but burning with something powerful inside. He cleared his throat, his French shaky but determined. I don't have a papa. I live in a refugee camp." His voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire studio. One day, President Traoré came to visit. No cameras, no big cars, just him walking through our tents. The studio held its breath. I told him I wanted to be a soldier when I grow up. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "No, little brother, be a builder. Build what they tried to destroy." Tears were forming in the boy's eyes, but he continued. "He gave me shoes because mine had holes. He gave me books because I loved to read." Then the boy reached into his jacket and pulled out a tiny, worn French textbook. "He gave me this," he said, his voice cracking, "and he gave me dreams." A single tear rolled down his cheek as he held up the book like it was made of gold. "He gave me dreams." The crowd erupted into applause, not polite television clapping, but applause that came from the soul. Mark couldn't take it anymore. He had lost control of his own show, and the audience had shifted completely. They were no longer entertained. They were moved, and that terrified him more than anything. What happened next would expose the true character of both men and create the second viral moment that would define their legacies forever. Mark slammed his hand on the table so hard it echoed through the studio like a gunshot. "Enough of this emotional circus," he barked, his composure finally cracking completely. Gasps filled the room as his true nature was revealed. "You're a president, not a preacher. This is politics, not a sob story session." The audience recoiled at his outburst, but Ibrahim didn't even flinch. He looked at Mark with the calm of a man who had faced real storms and said simply, "Maybe you mistake power for noise. Let me show you what power really is." Without breaking eye contact, Ibrahim pulled out an official file, and suddenly screens lit up behind them showing live documents from the Burkina Faso government. Real-time reforms flashed across the displays. Schools being reopened, farmers receiving direct aid, infrastructure projects completed. No speeches, just evidence. No promises, just results. Mark's mouth hung open as the data scrolled past, showing a country being rebuilt while other nations only talked. Then Ibrahim leaned forward and delivered the line that would define his legacy. "History won't remember insults, but it will never forget impact." A backstage assistant, moved by what she was witnessing, secretly pulled out her phone and started recording. She caught the exact moment when Traoré looked directly into the camera and said those words. Within minutes, that clip hit social media. Within an hour, it had 1 million views. By nightfall, 10 million people had watched it, and the number kept climbing. In Burkina Faso, young boys gathered around old radios in remote villages, replaying every word. In France, celebrities shared the video in stunned admiration. Even his harshest critics were forced to admit, this man, he didn't shout. He simply stood. People cried watching it, not out of pity, but out of pride. Finally, a leader who didn't perform. He proved. But the most powerful moment was still to come, and it would happen away from the cameras, in the quiet space where real transformation begins. After the broadcast ended, Mark stormed into the green room, his hands trembling as he poured himself a glass of water. He had underestimated Ibrahim Traoré, not just the man, but everything he carried with him. Truth, vision, pain, hope. The weight of his mistake was crushing him. Then the door creaked open, and Ibrahim stepped in, alone. This time, Mark didn't speak. He couldn't. Ibrahim walked up to him slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost fatherly. "The world doesn't need more loud men," he said quietly. "It needs brave ones." Without waiting for a reply, without gloating or grandstanding, he turned and left. Mark sat down heavily, staring at the empty chair across from him. He didn't know it yet, but his life had just changed forever. So had millions of others. By morning, the video had reached every corner of Africa, and something beautiful was happening. In Ouagadougou, an elderly man wiped tears from his eyes as he turned to his grandchildren. "That's my president," he whispered with pride that could move mountains. In Paris, a young girl hugged her mother tightly after watching the video. "Mama," she said, "he looks like us. He speaks with his heart." Across Europe, the media scrambled to spin the story. Some called Traoré too emotional, others labeled him dangerous. But none could deny the truth that was spreading like sunrise across the continent. The people were rising behind him. At the presidential residence in Burkina Faso, Ibrahim sat quietly with his team. He wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating. He was thinking because he knew something bigger had started, something that couldn't be stopped. His phone buzzed. A known number. He answered anyway. A quiet voice spoke in broken French, nervous but determined. It was Mariam, a nurse from northern Burkina Faso. "I don't know if this is really you," she said, her words rushing together. "But I had to call. My son watched your video tonight and said, 'Mama, I want to be like him. I've never seen him so proud to be Burkinabe.'" Ibrahim's voice broke, not from weakness but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility and love he felt for his people. He didn't say much, just 2 words that carried everything. "Thank you." After the call, he walked alone onto his hotel balcony. The Eiffel Tower shone in the distance, But his heart was in Kaya, in Dori, in the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso. This wasn't about television anymore. It was about dignity, about hope, about proving that leadership isn't about performance but about service. Meanwhile, Mark couldn't sleep. He rewatched the video again and again, seeing himself through the world's eyes. He had mocked a man who stood for millions. He had spoken over pain, dismissed hope, and the internet hadn't just called him out. They had moved on without him, and somehow that hurt more than any criticism. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. The next morning, he went live on his social media, alone in his apartment, no makeup, no script. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Last night, I disrespected a man who represents something I didn't understand. I was arrogant. I was wrong." The clip didn't go viral, but Ibrahim saw it. He smiled gently, not because he had won, but because truth had finally been heard. 6 days after the interview, Ibrahim returned to Ouagadougou. There was no red carpet waiting, no orchestra playing, no political theater. But tens of thousands of people lined the road from the airport, and they weren't waving signs or shouting slogans. Instead, they stood quietly with their right hands placed over their hearts, a gesture of silent respect that spoke louder than any crowd could roar. Even the children stood perfectly still, understanding somehow that they were part of something sacred. Ibrahim stepped off the plane, looked at his people gathered there in the African sun, and simply nodded. No speeches, no grand gestures. He had already said everything that needed to be said. That single moment, a leader walking quietly into his nation with the dignity of a king and the humility of a servant, with his people standing behind him in silent solidarity, became the most shared video of the year. It showed the world something they had forgotten. True power doesn't need to announce itself. He hadn't fought with anger. He had fought with dignity. And the world had listened. The letters kept coming to his office, each one a testament to the power of authentic leadership. But one letter stood out, written by a woman from the village of Fada whose handwriting was shaky but whose words were crystal clear. "President Ibrahim," she wrote, "my son died last year during a terrorist attack. We buried him with no flag, no ceremony, just our tears and our prayers. Today I watched you on that French program, and I cried. But not because I was sad. I cried because for the first time since we lost him, I felt seen. I felt proud. Thank you for making us proud to be from this land. A grieving mother who now has hope again." Ibrahim held that letter for a long time, reading it over and over until he had memorized every word. Then he walked alone into the hotel courtyard, looked up at the stars scattered across the African sky like diamonds, and whispered a promise that carried on the wind. "For all of them, I will not stop." That night, as the world slept, something had changed forever. A man had shown that dignity defeats disrespect, that truth trumps theater, and that real leadership isn't about commanding respect but about earning it through service. In refugee camps across the Sahel, children fell asleep to the sound of their parents retelling the story of the president who stood up to the world with nothing but his truth. In universities across Africa, students stayed up late discussing what they had witnessed, planning how they could serve their own communities with the same quiet strength. And in a small TV studio in Paris, the cleaning crew worked in unusual silence, somehow sensing that they were sweeping up the remnants of history. If the story moved your heart, if you felt the power of dignity over disrespect, don't let this moment pass. Hit that like button if you believe the world needs more leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. Drop a comment with just one word: respect. And please, share the story with everyone you know, because the world needs to remember that men and women like this still exist, still fight, and still believe in the power of serving others before themselves. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate courage, truth, and the unbreakable spirit of Africa. Thank you for watching. Long live courage. Long live Burkina Faso. Long live the leaders who choose service over self.